Hello, this is the next in a series of talks about divine providence, one of the most powerful ideas you could ever hold in your mind. It is God's grand design both for the universe and for your life. Not that we can always understand what that is or interpret that in the light of, or interpret events in our lives in the light of that in every instance or immediately, but just to be aware of it and to react to events in accordance with it is one of the most important things that we could possibly do. I'd like to talk about it in relation to some things that were going on in the Cold War, especially with regard to the idea of security. Security was a fanatical preoccupation, really, throughout the 50s. My father, for instance, who died in 1970, became court-appointed defense counsel for a Soviet spy, and shortly after that, because we were still in 1957 in the McCarthy era, you might characterize it, we had to change our telephone number and in general just be very careful. Not that my father was an actual leftist sympathizer in any way, but some people thought that he might be, so we received threatening telephone calls. But it was an era in which we began to wonder increasingly whether missiles were pointing in our direction, whether the missiles that did exist in Russia could in fact reach the United States. Intercontinental ballistic missiles were just becoming possible in the late 50s. And that was the reason why Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, flew over Russia to see what missiles existed over there in what quantities. But with respect to Cuba, the missiles, of course, were pointing in our direction, and it became the most tense moment in the history of the world that a crisis developed over that. And looking at it from the other side, from the Cuban side, there was, after the Bay of Pigs, a constant sense, which was exacerbated by radio broadcasts, that the United States was going to attack Cuba. And that, in fact, was the very reason why my father, who negotiated the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners in 1962, his name was James Donovan, brought me to Cuba as a gesture of confidence. I was only an 18-year-old. As a gesture of confidence to Castro, because Castro's advisors were saying to him that my father might be a decoy for an impending American invasion, that he might be analogous to the Japanese ambassadors talking peace in Washington in 1941 at the moment that airplanes were flying toward Pearl Harbor. And so as a gesture of confidence, as a peace hostage, if you will, I was brought along for that purpose. But I'm emphasizing that part of providence really involves the emphasis on security, whether you're talking about national security or you're talking even about personal security. Nothing could be more inspiring as a source of a feeling of personal security than the idea of God's providential care and provision, or as it is expressed in the old Negro spiritual, he's got the whole world in his hands. We can discipline our minds to react to all the events of our lives in terms of these assurances which we find in divine in Holy Scripture, assurances about God's providential care for our lives. Thinking about these things can become a way of thought and a way of life. And once that begins to take hold with us, we will find that His providence is such that it gives us the peace and the joy that we all seek.